In the summer of 1942, in a wooden barracks on a tropical airfield called Rabaul, the best fighter pilots in the world sat down with each other after dark and asked a question none of them could answer. Who had taught the Americans to fight like this? They had been killing American pilots, British pilots, Dutch pilots, Australian pilots for 10 years, from China to Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. They flew the finest carrier fighter ever built. They had trained since they were teenagers. They knew they were the best the way a man knows his own name. And now, suddenly, two American boys flying an inferior airplane could defeat any one of them, every single time, no matter how good he was. The man who had built the thing that was killing them was 8,000 miles away. He had never been to Rabaul. He had never seen a zero in the air. He had figured it out on the kitchen table of a rented house in Coronado, California, in the summer before the war began, with a box of ordinary matchsticks. His name was Jimmy Thack. And this is how he did it. August 7th, 1942, the Solomon Islands, a few minutes past 1 in the afternoon. 18 Mitsubishi Zeros from the Tainan Air Group crossed the long blue distance from Rabaul and arrived over the southern coast of Guadalcanal, and the men inside those cockpits looked down at something they had been told was impossible. American transport ships, American destroyers, American Marines on the beach below them, already ashore, already digging in, the first opposed amphibious landing the United States had ever conducted in the Pacific War, and the Imperial Japanese Navy had been given no warning of it at all. Among the 18 pilots in those Zeros was a wiry, soft-spoken man from a samurai family lineage that stretched back centuries. His name was Saburo Sakai. He was 25 years old. He held the rank of Petty Officer First Class, which in the rigidly stratified world of the Imperial Navy meant he was a senior enlisted aviator with no commission, no academy ring, and a flight log thick enough to make most of the officers in his unit look like beginners. He had been killing pilots since the war in China. He flew his Zero with a tailcode Allied recognition officers had begun circling on debrief charts, because the man flying it never seemed to lose. Above him in the formation flew Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, 33 years old, the Hikotaisho, the senior airborne combat leader of one of the most decorated fighter units in the Imperial Navy. The man his pilots looked to in the seconds before contact. What happened in the next 48 hours over the Solomons would change something in the Imperial Japanese Navy that would never be put right again. When Nakajima landed at Rabaul that week and climbed down the side of his Zero, his hand was shaking on the cockpit ladder. He could not for some minutes find the words for what he wanted to say. He had been the hunter. He had picked his target, slid into firing position behind an American Wildcat, and a second Wildcat that had no business being where it was had come at him from the side, head on, guns lit. He had never seen it coming. He had broken off. He had run. He had survived. And he did not know how. The pilots in the barracks at Rabaul that night asked the same question of each other in different ways until the alcohol ran out. The Americans were not gifted dogfighters. The Americans flew an inferior airplane. The Americans had been dying in droves for 8 months, and now suddenly 2 of them together could defeat one of the best pilots in the Imperial Navy every single time, no matter how good he was. Who had taught the Americans to fight like this? Nobody in that barracks had an answer. By the time the Imperial Navy understood the answer, the men who could have done something about it would already be dead in the waters off Guadalcanal, off Santa Cruz, off the Philippine Sea. The question would no longer matter. There would be no one left who could fly a reply. The answer was the man we have already met. The soft-spoken commander in California, with his matchsticks and his quiet certainty. The full name on his Naval Academy records was John Smith Thack. The story of what he did in the summer of 1941 is one of the strangest and most consequential acts of pre-war military thinking the United States Navy ever produced. But before we get to him, we have to understand what he was working against. By every conventional measure of the early 1940s, the Japanese were the better fighter pilots in the Pacific. They had been the better fighter pilots since the air war over China in the late 1930s. They were flying a better airplane. They were the apex predators of carrier aviation, and in the first 6 months of the Pacific War, they proved it from Hawaii to Ceylon. The Imperial Navy had built this advantage on a deliberate choice made in the late 1920s, quality over quantity. Beginning in 1930, the Navy launched the Yokaran program, the Flight Reserve Trainee program, which took young Japanese boys aged 15 to 17 and put them through one of the most rigorous flight training pipelines in the world. The selection was savage. In 1937, when 1,500 sailors applied for the equivalent program for non-commissioned officers, 70 were accepted, 25 graduated. Sakai himself was one of those 25. He had earned a silver watch presented to him by Emperor Hirohito for graduating first in his class at Tsuchiura. By the time he was 23 years old, he was already one of the top fighter pilots in the empire. Men like Sakai drilled in deflection shooting until they could put a burst into a target the size of a dinner plate from 300 meters. They learned to land on a pitching carrier deck in heavy weather. They learned to read the surface wind off the ocean from 5,000 feet up. They learned to fly at night without instruments. The doctrine they were taught held that the dogfight was, at heart, a duel between samurai. The pilot who flew best, who saw first, who shot truest, won. The pilot who did not, lost. There was no other category. The aircraft they were given matched the doctrine. The Mitsubishi A6M Type 0, designed under Chief Engineer Jiro Horikoshi and entering service in 1940, was a machine built around a single principle: it would outturn anything in the sky. To achieve this, the Mitsubishi designers stripped weight from the airframe with a fanaticism that bordered on religious. They removed the armor plate behind the pilot's seat. They removed the self-sealing rubber lining from the fuel tanks. They thinned the wing skin. In exchange for that fragility, they got an aircraft that could climb at over 3,000 feet per minute, turn inside any Allied fighter then in service, and engage at ranges no other carrier fighter in the world could match. A Zero could fly a combat radius of more than 500 nautical miles. Allied planners refused to believe their own intelligence reports when they first saw the number. The result, when this aircraft and these men met the Allied air forces in December of 1941, was carnage. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies. The Great Indian Ocean raid that drove the Royal Navy out of Southeast Asia. Zeros tore through Brewster Buffaloes and Curtiss Warhawks and Hawker Hurricanes with a kill ratio that approached 12 to 1. By April of 1942, an Allied pilot who attempted to dogfight a Zero was understood, in every air force flying against the Japanese, to be a dead man. Standing orders in some American squadrons specifically forbade pilots from turning with a Zero under any circumstances. The recommended counter was to dive, run, and hope for clouds. This was the world that John Smith Thack was looking at in the spring of 1941 when, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, he was given command of Fighting Squadron 3 at Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego. He had just turned 36. He went by Jimmy because an older brother named James had been at the Naval Academy ahead of him, and the upperclassmen had hung the nickname on him before he could shake it. He was tall, lanky, soft-spoken, with a slow Arkansas drawl that made strangers underestimate him. He was not, by the standards of the pre-war Navy, a brilliant officer in the way the term was usually meant. He had not topped his class at Annapolis. He had not made his name with daring stunts. He had not posted the highest gunnery scores in the fleet. What he had was a quality quieter than that and harder to see. He thought about problems all the way down until they came apart in his hands. And in the late summer of 1941, while most squadron commanders in the Navy were content to wait for official guidance from above, Thack did something the others did not. He went looking for trouble. He pulled strings. He requested every scrap of intelligence the Office of Naval Intelligence had collected on the new Japanese carrier fighter, and he kept asking until something landed on his desk. What landed on his desk was a document dated September 22, 1941, the Fleet Air Tactical Unit Intelligence Bulletin. It contained a description of the Mitsubishi Zero pieced together from observations by the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, who were already flying combat against Japanese aircraft over China. The bulletin reported a fighter that climbed at more than 5,000 feet per minute, turned inside any American fighter known to exist, and operated at ranges the Wildcat could not match. The actual climb rate of the Zero was closer to 3,100 feet per minute. The bulletin overstated it, but either way the picture it painted was bleak. The airplane Thach and his pilots were flying was about to be sent against an enemy aircraft they could not turn with, could not climb with, and could not run from. He read the numbers. He read them again. The Wildcat was tougher, yes. It had armor, it had self-sealing tanks, it had a punishing armament of 650 caliber Browning machine guns. None of that mattered. If the Zero could choose when and where to fight, he took the bulletin home with him that night. To the rented house in Coronado, where he and his wife Madeleine were living, he sat down at the kitchen table. The lights were low, the house was quiet. He opened a box of ordinary matchsticks, he laid them out on the wood grain, and he began to play. The matchsticks were aircraft, the grain of the table was sky. He moved them slowly, one at a time, watching how each formation could and could not respond to attack from each angle. He did this for an hour. He did it again the next night, and the night after that. Tactic at midnight, flight test the next morning over San Diego Bay, debrief in the afternoon, rearrange the matchsticks. Try again. He did not know yet that what was forming on his kitchen table would be taught 80 years later in every Western air combat training course on Earth. He did not know that the man whose pilots would one day shake on the cockpit ladder at Rabaul was already, somewhere on the other side of the Pacific, flying combat over China with a samurai lineage behind him and a silver watch from the emperor in his footlocker. He only knew that he had to find an answer, and he had to find it before the war found him. In the autumn of 1941, he walked into the squadron ready room one morning and called over the sharpest aviator he had, a 27-year-old lieutenant from Chicago. The son of a lawyer with a complicated past, a graduate of Annapolis, class of 1937. His name was Edward Henry O'Hare. His friends called him Butch. Thach had a strange request for him. He wanted O'Hare to try to kill him, and he wanted O'Hare to do it with the throttle wired down. The first thing Thach had figured out, sitting at that kitchen table with his matchsticks, was that the standard American fighter formation was hopeless. The Navy in 1941 still flew the way the Army Air Corps flew, 3 aircraft to a section, a leader in the middle, 2 wingmen flanking him. The wingmen spent so much energy holding their position relative to the leader that they could not look behind them. They were prisoners of their own geometry. Against a faster opponent who could choose when to attack, they were going to die in flight. Thach decided the basic tactical unit had to be a pair. 2 aircraft side by side, watching each other's tails rather than each other's wings. He wrote up the proposal, he sent it up the chain. The United States Navy formally adopted the 2-plane section as its basic fighter element in July of 1941, partly on his recommendation. That change alone would have saved American pilots. It was not enough. He kept moving the matchsticks. He turned them. He slid them across the grain. 2 Wildcats, no matter how alert, could not survive a Zero that could attack, miss, climb away faster, and come back from a different angle whenever it pleased. The pair could see the threat. The pair could not catch it. He needed something more. The answer, when it came to him, was geometric. It was almost embarrassingly simple. 2 pairs, 4 aircraft flying abreast, separated by a distance roughly equal to the turning radius of a Wildcat. When the Zero attacked one pair, the other pair turned toward the pair under attack. The pair under attack turned toward the rescuers. The 2 pairs crossed paths, and the Zero, focused on the bait, suddenly found itself looking down the gun barrels of the second pair, which was now flying straight at it head-on. If the Zero pressed its attack, it died. If it broke off, the rescuers swung around onto its tail. There was no third option. The trap was geometric. It did not depend on individual brilliance. It did not depend on superior gunnery. It did not depend on the airplane being equal to the Zero. It depended only on 2 pairs of pilots executing a simple turn at the right moment. Anyone could be trained to do it. That was the genius of it. Thach called the maneuver the beam defense position because the second pair came in from the side, from the beam of the attacker. He used that name in his official correspondence for years. The pilots in his squadron called it something simpler within weeks. They called it the weave, because that was what it looked like from the air. Two pairs of fighters weaving in and out across each other's flight paths like threads in a loom. The name that history would give it, the name written into every air combat manual in the Western world, was not Thach's idea at all. It was given to the maneuver the following year by his close friend, Lieutenant Commander James Henry Flatley, in a personal letter to Thach during the summer of 1942. Flatley called it the Thach Weave. The name stuck. Thach himself, for the rest of his life, kept calling it the beam defense position. He thought naming the thing after himself was bad form. He knew, before he tested it in the air, that something this strange had to be proven. So in the autumn of 1941, he set up an experiment that has become legendary in the history of American naval aviation. He called Butch O'Hare into the ready room. O'Hare was 27 years old, the son of Edward Joseph O'Hare, a Chicago lawyer who had helped the federal government convict Al Capone of tax evasion and who had been shot to death in his car on a Chicago street in November of 1939, shortly before Capone was paroled from federal prison. The son carried that history quietly. He had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1937. He flew the Wildcat better than anyone in Fighting 3. Thach picked him because he wanted the sharpest aviator in his squadron playing the attacker. The whole point was to see whether the Weave could survive against the best man he had. Thach explained what he wanted. O'Hare would lead a flight of Wildcats playing the role of attackers, flying at full power. Thach himself would lead a flight playing the role of defenders, flying the beam defense position with their throttles wired down to half power, simulating the performance handicap of fighting a faster Japanese opponent. The throttle wires were a small detail with large consequences. They locked the defenders' engines at half their available output, which meant the defenders could not simply outrun their problems. They had to solve them with geometry alone. They went up over San Diego Bay. O'Hare attacked from above. He attacked from astern. He attacked from every angle and altitude he could think of. Every single time, with the defenders running at half power, Thach's pilots either ruined his attack or maneuvered into position to shoot back, every single time. After they landed and taxied back to the line, O'Hare climbed out of his cockpit. He walked over to Thach with his flight helmet still on his head. He stopped in front of him. And he said the words that became the founding scripture of American carrier fighter doctrine. "Skipper, it really worked. I couldn't make any attack without seeing the nose of one of your airplanes pointed at me." Thach had done it on a kitchen table, with matchsticks, months before he would ever see a Zero in the air. 2 months later, in the dark before dawn on December 7, 1941, the war found him. The war found everyone. The Imperial Japanese Navy attacked Pearl Harbor at 7:55 in the morning, Hawaii time. Within 48 hours, the United States had lost most of its battleship line, hundreds of aircraft on the ground in the Philippines, and the strategic initiative across the entire Pacific Basin. Fighting 3 was reassigned almost immediately. The squadron was transferred to the carrier Lexington and pushed out into the South Pacific to do whatever could be done. Thach drilled his pilots in the Weave on every cross-deck flight, in every working up exercise, on every transit. He knew now, in a way he had not quite known before, that the maneuver was not an academic exercise. It was a question of whether his men came home. On February 20th, 1942, just 2.5 months into the war, the Lexington was steaming toward the Japanese base at Rabaul when she was located by Japanese long-range bombers. 2 flights of Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, 9 aircraft each, came in to attack her. The Combat Air Patrol of Wildcats got into the first flight and broke it apart. By the time the second flight came in, only 2 Wildcats remained airborne with fuel and ammunition over the carrier. Butch O'Hare was one of them. His wingman's guns jammed on the first pass. O'Hare was alone. He flew his Wildcat into a formation of 9 bombers by himself. He attacked from the high beam, picked his shots, and worked his way down the formation. In the 4 minutes that followed, he was officially credited with shooting down 5 of the 9 Betty bombers and damaging a 6th. Modern research suggests the actual number was closer to 3, but the official credit of 5 was what made him an instant national hero. He saved the Lexington. He became the United States Navy's first ace of the Pacific War. He was the first naval aviator awarded the Medal of Honor in World War II. President Roosevelt presented him with the medal at the White House on April 21, 1942. O'Hare was 28 years old. He stood beside his wife Rita and his mother Selma in a photograph that ran in newspapers across America. He had done all of it alone. The weave had nothing to do with it. The maneuver Thack had spent months perfecting on his kitchen table, the maneuver Butch O'Hare had personally pressure tested over San Diego Bay, had still not been used in combat. Not once. The men who knew how to fly it were waiting for the moment. The moment came at Midway. The morning of June 4, 1942, the American carrier Yorktown launched her strike group at about 8:40 in the morning. 6 F-4F Wildcats of Fighting 3, led by Jimmy Thack himself, lifted off her deck. They were the only fighter escort for 12 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers of Torpedo 3. Dauntless dive bombers of Bombing 3 followed behind, 6 fighters, to cover an entire torpedo squadron and an entire dive bomber squadron, against the most dangerous fighter air arm in the world. Thack had to revise his formation in the air. 6 aircraft was not cleanly divisible into 2 pairs of 2 pairs. He took Ensign Robert Allen Murray Dibb as his wingman. Everyone in the squadron called him Ram. Dibb was 21 years old. He had joined Fighting 3 a few weeks earlier. His familiarity with the weave consisted of one rushed practice flight with Thack a few days before takeoff. Thack paired Lieutenant Junior Grade Brainard Tucker Macomber, on loan from Fighting 42, with Ensign Edgar Bassett, also from 42. Macomber's radio failed somewhere on the way to the target. He had never been formally trained in the weave, 2 facts that would matter very much in the next 30 minutes. The remaining 2 Wildcats, flown by machinist Tom Cheek and Ensign Daniel Sheedy, were detached to fly low cover for the slow Devastators. They would fight their own separate engagement at low altitude that morning. The American formation approached the Japanese fleet. The Devastators began their long, slow descent toward the water, lining up for torpedo runs. Thack climbed his 4 Wildcats above them, watching the sky. The Zeros came down out of it like falling rain. The Japanese Carrier Combat Air Patrol that morning, the official count from the Naval Aviation Museum, was between 15 and 20 Zeros directly over Thack's engagement, possibly more. Pilots in the formation later remembered seeing the sky filled with them. Bassett never had a chance. A Zero caught him on the first pass. The Wildcats slanted toward the water. It burst into flame. Edgar Bassett was in his mid-20s. He died in less than 30 seconds. There was no time for anyone to do anything for him. Macomber's Wildcat was hit on the same pass. His engine kept running. His radio had failed earlier in the flight. He stayed in the air. He had no way to call for help and no way to hear orders. He was effectively flying alone in the middle of a swarm of Japanese fighters. Thack found himself with 3 serviceable Wildcats, one of them flown by a pilot who could not speak to the others. One of them flown by a 21-year-old who had practiced the weave exactly once, and the man on his wing whose throat had just gone dry. He had a few seconds to decide what to do. What he did in those seconds is one of the most remarkable acts of small unit leadership in the history of fighter combat. He waved Dibb out wide to the right with his hand. Across the gap between the cockpits, in the middle of an air battle, the squadron commander gave a 21-year-old ensign, with one practice flight under his belt, a hand signal that promoted him to section leader. Then he turned in his seat and motioned for Macomber to follow Dibb. The Zeros pounced on Dibb almost immediately, exactly as Thack had wanted. Dibb radioed for help and turned hard back toward Thack. Thack turned into him. Macomber, not knowing what was happening, but doing what he was told, followed. The 2 Wildcats crossed paths. Thack pulled his airplane under his wingman's wing, lined up the underside of the pursuing Zero in his sights, and squeezed the trigger. The .650 caliber Browning machine guns in the Wildcat's wings put out a sheet of fire that opened a line of holes from the engine cowling back along the Zero's fuselage. The lightweight magnesium-aluminum airframe came apart. The Zero shed pieces of its cowling. It burst into flame. It fell. Thack turned again. Dibb turned again. Macomber, somewhere in the back of his mind starting to understand what was happening, turned with them. Another Zero came in. The geometry held. The geometry caught it. The geometry killed it. Then it happened a third time. The Zero pilots, trained from their first day at the Naval Academy at Tsuchiura to think of the dogfight as a one-against-one duel between samurai, kept committing to the bait. Their entire doctrine told them to press the attack. Their entire doctrine told them that the better pilot won the duel. They had been the better pilots by every measure that mattered for 10 years. Each time, the second wildcat was already pointed at them by the time they understood what was happening. They were dying because of what they had been taught. One Zero pilot, attacking Makomba, made the mistake of failing to follow his target through the turn. He slowed up to correct his aim. He was killed by Thak in passing. Another Zero tried to follow Dib through the weave instead of breaking off. He was killed by Thak as he crossed in front of him. There was a kind of grim metronome to it. The Japanese pilots could not stop. They came at the Americans the way they had always come at the Americans, one at a time, picking their targets, sliding in behind. And one at a time the Americans turned into each other, and the Japanese died. The torpedo squadron below them was not so lucky. Of the 12 devastators of Torpedo 3, 10 were shot down. Most of the men in them were killed. The same was true of the other 2 torpedo squadrons attacking the Japanese carriers that morning, Torpedo 8 from Hornet and Torpedo 6 from Enterprise. Of 41 torpedo bombers committed, only 6 returned. Their deaths drew the Japanese combat air patrol down to the wave tops at exactly the moment the American dive bombers arrived high overhead. In 5 minutes between 10:20 and 10:25 in the morning, those dive bombers sank 3 of the 4 Japanese fleet carriers participating in the attack. By the end of the day, the 4th carrier, Hiryu, was burning as well. It was the most decisive carrier battle of the Pacific War. It was the moment the strategic initiative in the Pacific passed permanently to the United States. And up above all of it, in the middle of his own small piece of that day, Jimmy Thak was running the weave with 3 Wildcats against 15 or 20 of the best fighter pilots in the world. And it was working. When the Japanese finally broke contact and Thak turned what remained of his division for the Yorktown, the count was almost impossible to believe. Thak himself claimed 3 Zeros confirmed. Dib claimed 1. Makomba, frustrated and breaking formation in the heat of it, claimed a probable. Cheek and Sheedy, fighting their separate engagement at low altitude, accounted for at least 1 more Zero between them. 6 Wildcats had gone out. 5 had come back. They had killed 5 or 6 Japanese fighters, possibly more. They had blooded the Imperial Japanese Navy's frontline carrier combat air patrol. They had done it while outnumbered 4 or 5 to 1, with 1 pilot dead in the first 30 seconds and another flying with a silent radio. Thak sat down in the Yorktown's ready room that evening to write his report. He had just done something no fighter pilot had ever done before. He chose his words carefully. The truth, he wrote, was that any success against the Japanese Zero fighter was not due to the performance of the Wildcat. It was due to the comparatively poor marksmanship of the Japanese. To the stupid mistakes made by a few of their pilots, to the superior marksmanship and teamwork of some of his own. He was understating it. He knew he was understating it. The man on his right wing had been on Yorktown for less than a month. The man behind him had been flying with a radio that did not work. He had run the maneuver by hand signal in the middle of an air battle, and the maneuver had worked anyway. That was the discovery. That was what mattered. Not how many Zeros he had personally shot down. The thing he had built on his kitchen table could be executed by a 21-year-old kid with 1 practice flight in the middle of a swarm of enemy fighters, with the radio dead and the squadron commander signaling with his hands. And it would still work. Thak did not write that in the report. He never did. If the story stopped at Midway, the weave would be a curiosity in the memoirs of 1 squadron. What makes it a tactical revolution is what happened next. Within weeks, the maneuver had spread across the United States Navy and Marine Corps fighter community. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, who had been the executive officer of Fighting 42 at the Battle of the Coral Sea a month before Midway, was now forming Fighting Squadron 10 on the carrier Enterprise. He called his squadron the Grim Reapers. He picked up the weave from Thak's report. He began drilling his pilots in it on every working up exercise. He sent Thak a personal letter that summer. "I am calling it the Thack Weave," he wrote, "for your information." In October of 1942, at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, Flatley used the weave himself. His division of 4 Wildcats was engaged by Zeros from the Japanese carrier Junyo. One Japanese pilot, Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga, made several attack runs against Flatley's section. Found himself looking down the guns of a second Wildcat each time, eventually broke off. Marine pilots flying off the rough coral airstrip at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, men who slept in tents and drank water out of cut-down oil drums and lived through the nightly bombardments of the Tokyo Express, started using the weave against the Tainan Air Group's Zeros from Rabaul. Henderson Field had been a Japanese airstrip until the Marines took it in the first days of the campaign. It was renamed for Major Lofton Henderson, the Marine dive bomber leader killed at Midway. The pilots who flew the worn-out Wildcats of Henderson called themselves the Cactus Air Force, after the radio code name for the airfield. They were chronically short of spare parts, chronically short of fuel, chronically short of pilots, and chronically outnumbered. They flew the weave anyway. By late 1942, every Wildcat squadron in the South Pacific had some version of the maneuver in its tactical playbook. Joe Foss, the Marine ace who would end the Guadalcanal campaign with 26 confirmed kills and a Medal of Honor, used variants of it. Even dauntless dive bomber crews adopted it on their return runs from carrier strikes because 2 of them flying the weave gave their rear gunners clean shots at any Zero pursuing the other. The maneuver scaled. It worked between fighters, it worked between bombers, it worked between mixed flights. As long as 2 aircraft would commit to watching each other's tails, the geometry of the trap held. And 8,000 miles away, on a tropical airfield called Rabaul, the men of the Tainan Air Group were 2 months away from learning what the weave was. 2 months passed. The carriers Akagi and Kaga and Soryu and Hiryu lay on the bottom of the Pacific, the strategic initiative the Imperial Navy had carried since Pearl Harbor was gone. On the morning of August 7, 1942, the United States Marines came ashore at Guadalcanal. It was the first opposed amphibious landing the United States had conducted in the Pacific War. It was the beginning of a 6-month campaign that would gut the Imperial Navy's veteran aviator community and never give it back. Tadashi Nakajima led 18 Zeros of the Tainan Air Group down from Rabaul that afternoon. He did not yet know about the weave he was about to find out, and so was Saburo Sakai. Earlier that morning, Sakai had run into a different kind of American pilot than the ones he had been killing for 8 months. The Wildcat he picked out of a tangling dogfight over the Channel was flown by Lieutenant James Julian Pug Sutherland of Fighting Squadron 5 off the carrier Saratoga. Sutherland was a Naval Academy graduate, class of 1936. He had already shot down 2 Japanese bombers that morning when his guns jammed. He kept fighting anyway. He could not shoot. He could fly. He kept turning inside the Zeros that came at him. Sakai was astonished at how much punishment the Wildcat could absorb. He fired over 200 rounds into Sutherland's airplane before he landed a single 20mm cannon shell below the left-wing root and finally brought it down. Sutherland bailed out into the jungle below with 11 wounds. He was found by Solomon Islanders. They hid him. They treated him. They helped him reach the coast. He was evacuated from Henderson Field on the 20th of August. He survived the war. He ended it as a 5-victory ace. Sakai went home to Rabaul with another tally on his canopy and the uneasy feeling that something had changed. He had been one of the best fighter pilots in the world for 3 years. He had never had to work that hard to kill one airplane before. That afternoon, on the second sortie of the day, he made a mistake. He spotted a flight of 8 aircraft below him at about 7,800 feet. He took them for Wildcats. He dove. He picked the lead aircraft and lined up a deflection shot. They were not Wildcats. They were Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from a mixed flight of Bombing 5 and Bombing 6 off the carrier Enterprise. Each of them had a rear gunner with a fixed machine gun mount aimed straight back over the tail. The aircraft Sakai had picked was flown by Ensign Robert C. Shaw. Its rear gunner was Aviation Ordnanceman 2nd Class Harold L. Jones. 22 years old, Sakai opened fire. Jones returned it. A burst from the back seat shattered Sakai's canopy. A .30 caliber bullet creased his skull, blinded him in the right eye, paralyzed the left side of his body. The Zero rolled inverted and started down toward the ocean. Sakai, with one eye, partial paralysis, blood pooling in the cockpit, and no canopy pulled out of the dive. The cold air at altitude woke him up enough to think. He was 400 miles from home. He had a head wound. He chose not to die. He flew his Zero 560 nautical miles back to Rabaul. He navigated by the volcanic peaks he had memorized from earlier missions. It took him 4 hours and 47 minutes. He nearly crashed into a line of parked Zeros on his approach. He circled the field 4 times, with the fuel gauge reading empty. He landed on his second attempt. He insisted on making his mission report to his superior officer before he would let the medics put him in a stretcher. His friend Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, the Tainan's top ace, physically removed the waiting driver and drove Sakai to the unit surgeon himself. Sakai survived. He lost most of the vision in his right eye permanently. And here we have to look closely at why the Imperial Japanese Navy never produced its own answer to the weave, because the answer is not technical, it is structural. The reason lies in 2 decisions made before the war began. The first was the decision to keep the pilot training program small, selective, and elite. In 1940, when the Imperial Navy was asked whether to expand pilot training in anticipation of a long conflict, the proposal was rejected. Japan, the planners reasoned, could not win a long war against the United States. Therefore, Japan did not need to plan for one. The training pipeline would remain what it had always been. The men already in the cockpits would carry the war. The second was the decision, when the war turned, to keep the surviving veteran pilots on the front until they died there. The United States Navy, by contrast, started rotating its experienced combat aviators home in 1942 and 1943 to instruct the next class of trainees. The Imperial Navy did not. Sakai's training cohort, the elite Yokaran graduates of the late 1930s, kept flying combat missions until they were shot down. By the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, in February of 1943, the great majority of the experienced naval aviators who had attacked Pearl Harbor had been killed in action. The men who could read a fight, who knew when to commit and when to break off, who could spot the bait Wildcat offering itself up, were dead in the waters off Henderson Field, off Santa Cruz, off the Eastern Solomons. Their replacements, products of a compressed training program that had to push pilots through faster as losses mounted, did not have the experience to recognize a trap that a man like Nakajima had only recognized too late. Sakai himself, when he was finally pulled off operational duty after his head wound and assigned to train new pilots, wrote about the experience in 1943 with something close to despair. "We could not watch for individual errors," he said, "and take the long hours necessary to weed the faults out of a trainee. Hardly a day passed when fire engines and ambulances did not race down the runways, sirens shrieking, to dig one or more pilots out of the plane he had wrecked on a clumsy takeoff or landing. We were told to rush men through, to forget the fine points, just teach them how to fly and shoot." The man who had once flown combat from China to New Guinea was now watching teenagers kill themselves on the takeoff roll, and being ordered to send the survivors to the front anyway. While this was happening to the Japanese, the United States Navy was doing the opposite. In 1942 alone, the American Naval Aviation Training Program graduated almost 10,900 pilots. Nearly twice as many as had completed the program in the entire previous 8 years combined. By 1943, the figure was almost 20,800. Each of these new aviators reached the fleet with around 500 hours of flight time. Replacement air groups were established starting in April of 1944 to put a final polish on pilots before they joined operational units. By contrast, by 1945, Japanese pilots were being certified for combat duty with less than 4 months of training. Under 100 hours in the air, the result was visible in the numbers. The F-4F Wildcat, the aircraft Thak had designed the weave to keep alive, ended the war with an air-to-air kill ratio of approximately 6.9 to 1. Its successor, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, flying with the weave already baked into squadron standard tactics, achieved a kill ratio against the Mitsubishi Zero of better than 13 to 1. By the time of the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, an engagement the American pilots themselves nicknamed the Marianas Turkey Shoot, the Japanese were sending up barely trained teenagers in obsolete aircraft against American pilots, who had memorized every weakness of the Zero from intelligence reports and captured airframes. The slaughter was so one-sided that some American pilots in their after-action reports expressed something close to embarrassment. The men who had built the most elite pilot training program in the world had been undone by their own perfectionism. They had refused to compromise on quality. They could not make enough of what they had. The Americans, who had compromised on individual virtuosity in favor of teamwork and mass production and replaceability, had built a system that could absorb losses and keep generating pilots indefinitely. The weave was the first crack in the dam. Everything else flowed through it. Most of the men who made the weave work do not have monuments. Edward Butch O'Hare did not live to see the war end. On the night of November 26, 1943, he was leading a section of 3 aircraft from the carrier Enterprise. 2 F-6F Hellcats flown by him and Ensign Andy Scon, and a TBF Avenger torpedo bomber flown by Lieutenant Commander Phil Phillips. They were attempting one of the first nighttime fighter intercepts ever flown from a United States carrier. They were trying to break up a Japanese torpedo bomber attack on the American task force in the darkness. In the confusion of the night engagement, O'Hare's Hellcat went down. His body and his aircraft were never recovered. He was 29 years old. The Chicago airport that bears his name was renamed for him in 1949. Most of the people who fly through it every day do not know who he was. Robert Allen Murray Dibb, the 21-year-old kid Thack had pulled into the right hand of the weave at Midway, did not live either. He was killed in a flying accident on August 29, 1944. 2 years and 2 months after his combat debut, he had become an ace himself with 7 aerial victories. He was 23 years old. There is no statue of him anywhere. He is a footnote in most accounts of Midway. Saburo Sakai lived a long life. He died on September 22, 2000. He was 84 years old. He had retired from the Imperial Navy at the rank of Lieutenant Junior grade. He had become a Buddhist who refused to kill any living thing, not even a mosquito. He had become a critic of the war Japan had fought and a vocal opponent of the militarism that had sent his generation into the cockpits of those Zeros. He visited the United States more than once after the war. In 1983, near Los Angeles, an American historian named Henry Sakida arranged a meeting between Sakai and Harold L. Jones, the rear gunner from Bombing 6, the man whose machine gun bullet had nearly taken his life over Tulagi 41 years earlier. They exchanged gifts. They shook hands. Sakai produced the bullet-pierced flying helmet he had been wearing on the 7th of August 1942. It still bore the entry hole of Jones's marksmanship, 2 old men in a quiet room. Both of them survived something neither one had any business surviving. Jimmy Thack went on to a 40-year career. He commanded the escort carrier USS Sicily in the Korean War. He pioneered anti-submarine warfare doctrine in the late 1950s as commander of Task Group Alpha, work that became the template for how the United States Navy hunted Soviet submarines for the rest of the Cold War. He was promoted to 4-star admiral in 1965. He retired in May of 1967 as Commander-in-Chief, United States Naval Forces Europe. He died in Coronado, California on April 15, 1981. 4 days before his 76th birthday, in the same town where he had built the weave on his kitchen table 40 years earlier. When he was asked about it in his oral histories, he tended to deflect the credit to his pilots, especially to O'Hare, who had tested the maneuver for him, to Flatley, who had named it. The verdict on the Pacific Air War, the honest one, is not that the Americans were better individual pilots than the Japanese. They were not. Pilot for pilot, in 1942, the Imperial Naval Air Service was probably the best fighter community in the world. The verdict is that the Americans had stumbled into a better system, a doctrine that did not depend on the exceptional individual, married to a training pipeline that did not depend on the exceptional individual, married to an industrial base that did not depend on the exceptional individual. The weave was the moment when that system first proved its superiority over Japanese individual brilliance. and the Japanese never recovered the ground they lost in the months after Midway. If your father or grandfather flew in the Pacific War, if he worked the carrier flight decks, if he served in the air groups that made the long blue ocean campaigns possible, I would be honored to read his story in the comments below. The unit, the carrier, the aircraft, what he saw, those small specific personal details are the actual record of what happened in those years, and they deserve to be preserved by the people who carry them. So here finally is the answer to the question Sakai's pilots could not stop asking each other in the barracks at Rabaul in August of 1942. Who taught the Americans to do that? The answer is a soft-spoken man from Pine Bluff, Arkansas named Jimmy Thack, who in the summer before Pearl Harbor read an intelligence bulletin he could not ignore, sat down at his kitchen table with a box of matches, and worked through the geometry of how two aircraft could defeat one. He proved it on a wired throttle against Butch O'Hare in San Diego. He proved it again in actual combat at Midway, with a green wingman, a silent radio, and a hand signal. His friends and his pupils proved it again at Guadalcanal, at Santa Cruz, at the Philippine Sea. By the end, the men who had set out to be the best individual fighter pilots in the world had been beaten by men who had agreed in advance not to fight alone.